Welcome back to my part 2 series on countering Rush. If you missed the first one, be sure to click the link in the top right corner, because last time we looked at some land formations and generic strategies that I'm going to assume you know already. Today we're going to look at specific Rush archetypes, cards to watch out for, and some sample decks you can use to beat them. When you're building a deck to specifically counter Rush, you should generally be trying to keep your land count low so you can gain access to draws and +1 sooner. The critical moments in a Rush matchup will happen in the very early stages of the match, so you really need as many early resources as possible. You also can't counter every type of Rush out there using just one deck. You have to switch it up depending on the type of Rush you're facing. There are quite a few variants of Rush out there, but I'm going to go over 4 of the more common ones that you might face. And as always, I'll leave timestamps in the description if you want to jump ahead. We're going to start with Yellow Rush because it's one of the more traditional Rush colors. Here are some typical cards you'll find in a Yellow Rush deck. This can sometimes be built without very many haste creatures and with more sturdy bodies like Manta Rider and such, but I'm just going to cover the haste version for now because I think it's more popular overall. Yellow has a lot of cards that benefit from hitting an enemy god such as Khalim's Prayer and Zealous Crusader, which, by the way, an enemy god just refers to your orb if you don't know. And so their primary attacking tools are small haste creatures to trigger these, which allow for some very explosive turns. This also means that their game plan relies on getting as many face hits as possible using these little guys, and if they can't produce a creature within attacking distance to your orb, a lot of their creatures become very useless. So it's important to restrict where they can attack from, both with your lands and by body blocking the spaces adjacent to your orb. Remember that creatures with haste can still move, so if they have a desert right in front of your orb, they can simply sidestep onto your lands and drop more creatures to attack you with that turn. Body blocking may mean giving up well collections a lot more frequently than you would against a green or red Rush deck, but it can often pay off to sacrifice collections like this because of how powerful Prayer and Crusader can be. You also can't afford to lose as much life as you could against other Rush decks, because at any moment they could drop multiple haste creatures and kill you if you're not watching out. Other ways you can punish these little hasters is by using taunts. Green is especially good at countering this build of Yellow Rush because of all the taunt options it has access to. What better way to shut down small hasters than to drop a sturdy 7-life Living Willow right in front of your face? However, you shouldn't get too comfortable just having a singular taunt fending off all your opponent's creatures. Be prepared for yellow removal like Choking Sand or Last Nightmare, and make sure you have a backup plan just in case. Another great counter to yellow hasters is combat creatures, especially Underground Brigand and Underground Boss, since these give you extra resources and can probably survive a few hits before dying. Some other cards you should be watching out for apart from the haste creatures are the Sagittarius Archer. This is one of the most threatening cards early on since it can build up huge amounts of Faeria if left unanswered, gaining 1 every time a creature pokes you in the face. So you're going to want to have something like Flame Burst or Ninja Toad or other types of removal in your deck, or else you're going to have to put some pressure on D5 with your lands or creatures for when it inevitably comes down. You may even want to consider stepping in front of your orb and letting one of your creatures tank the 1 damage from this, since even letting the Archer poke you will trigger Prayer and Crusader. If you do this though, be careful you're not stepping into Soul Drain range. Soul Drain is really cheap and efficient removal for the Yellow Rush player, so if I have a creature at 3 life, I may not want to body block with it, or I'm just giving my opponent an easy clear. Wind Soldier is another piece of removal to be careful of. This one is a bit more expensive than Soul Drain, so it's not always as big a deal, but do be aware of leaving any 3-life creatures in a spot where your opponent could Wind Soldier and collect from the well with it. If they have to build lands to pull this off, it's not as bad, but if they don't, it can be a huge swing turn for your opponent. Wind Soldier also poses quite a threat to your orb if you're getting down to a low life total. Always pretend that you're at 3 less life than you actually are, because a Wind Soldier can easily come out of nowhere and finish you off. This is a good card to count how many times your opponent has played so far, because it's the highest attacking haste creature you'll have to deal with. And if you're getting to the late game and you've kept track of how many they've played so far, then you'll know whether you need to play around a double Wind Soldier or something like that. Another really spooky play they can make is by hitting your face with Wind Soldier, or any haste creature for that matter, and then using Demon Wrangler on it. Demon Wrangler is where this deck's explosiveness really shows, and this is one reason hand removal like Soul Drain or Cypher's Wrath can be quite handy, so you can preserve your creature's life. I would suggest to not hold your hand removal cards in anticipation for this play though. Even against small 2-attack creatures, it's often worth it just to kill these with hand removal to save that 2 life on your creature. Yellow has so many removal tools, you don't want to make it easier for them to kill one of your creatures. The only times I would hold my hand removal is if I could develop another creature that turn instead using my Faeria, or if I had something with really big stats that I invested a lot of Faeria into, and I was worried about Last Nightmare getting value on it. Hitting in like this and taking some damage on your big creature will make your opponent's Last Nightmare slightly worse, so it's in your best interest to do this. Here are some sample deck lists you can use to hard counter this version of Yellow Rush if you're really struggling against it. Mono Green Beastmaster, as I mentioned before, has lots of taunts, big things. Red Control has a lot of small removal tools to deal with all of the small hasters, and Red Combat, again, as I mentioned, combat creatures are very effective when fighting the little haste creatures. The other type of Yellow Rush that I mentioned should be countered differently than what we just talked about. Instead of so many hasters, it will use sturdier cards like Manta Rider and Mace Man, and this means that the usual counters to small hasters won't be as effective here. In fact, Living Willow, as I mentioned earlier, as being such a good card versus haste, won't be very good into most of the 4 or 5 attack stat lines that they run. You can tell pretty early on if they're the haste version or not based on whether they build a desert in front of their orb on turn 1, because this is the spot needed for Sagittarius Archer, and since the sturdier Yellow Rush doesn't run as many hasters, it has no need for this archer, so they will usually just double neutral right off the bat and build their deserts all in face range. Because you're not as worried about haste, you can pull your creatures back to collect off the wells more often, and afford to take some more hits to your face as well. They still probably have Wind Soldier to watch out for, so you can't afford to let your health drop too much, but Wind Soldier is about all I'd expect from this style in terms of haste. The mono green list I showed earlier won't be very effective against this version, but mono red can still do alright. Bulkier bodies such as 4/6 stat lines will be pretty effective here as well, since they can deal with all the various 4-life things while still surviving against something like a Shaitan Demon. Red Rush is usually more focused around combat creatures and getting them to face as quickly as possible. Hitting your orb does count as combat if you're not aware, so this will give the Rush player a huge advantage the more times they're able to hit face. You do have a bit more time to deal with these creatures than if you were facing haste creatures though, so do keep to both wells if you can, but try to make sure your creatures will be able to reach anything your opponent might summon on the following turn. If there's already a combat creature in range of your face, prioritize killing it or body blocking it above anything else, because there's nothing worse than giving your opponent free resources. Queensguard can be especially devastating early on because it can be played in face range on turn 2 using double neutrals, and this 3/6 taunting body can be pretty tough to deal with that early on. So for this reason, you'll want to lead with a sturdier body if you can. For example, going with Triton Warrior instead of Battletoads. Small, swarmy creatures like Battletoads are quite weak to combat creatures in general, since you'll have to give your opponent multiple combat triggers just to kill off their creature. Try to set up large bodies that can one-shot these combat creatures to reduce the number of combats that they get. Typically, you won't need more than 5 or 6 attack to deal with these, but some Red Rush players run Gift of Steel to give a surprise life boost, so always have that card in the back of your mind as well. Removal cards are another thing to watch out for. Cypher's Wrath and Flame Burst, pretty similar to Soul Drain Wind Soldier, are 2 and 3 damage removals that you should be aware of. Just like with Wind Soldier, you probably want to card count their Flame Bursts, and maybe even Cypher's Wrath, so that you're prepared for the late game. Card counting these and comparing that to your remaining life total can help you decide how much pressure you're really under, and at what point you should be thinking of counterattacking their orb. Unlike Yellow though, you won't have to worry about hard removal like Last Nightmare, which means you can drop as big of bodies as you like and pour as many buffs into a single creature as you like. Some Rush players also like to run Rakoacopter. It won't be super often, but you may want to consider playing out of AoE range, as long as it doesn't cripple you too much. Your only other concern is Axe Grinder. You should already be defending your well spots like I mentioned in the last video, but you'll have to be extra diligent against red to prevent them from getting an Axe Grinder spot. Thankfully, you have the luxury of seeing all your opponent's creatures before you make any decisions to land block or body block, because they won't be able to move right away, unlike the surprise hasters from Yellow Rush. The best lists to counter Red Rush will include bulky creatures or buffs such as what you'll find in a mono green deck or blue 7s. Definitely don't run any swarm lists if you're facing Red Rush often, but anything that can knock out combat creatures in one hit and still have reasonably efficient Faeria costs should do pretty well. Generally, you can sit back a bit while you fend off Red Rush, using the normal rush defense techniques I talked about last time. You will have to attack their orb at some point though, because they'll eventually find enough Flame Bursts to kill you. Some Red Rush decks will have a lot more burn cards too, and if this is the case, you really have to step on the gas early unless you have a lot of healing in your deck. Green Rush has a simple game plan of dropping decent statted creatures at your face and using their many buffs to make them too big to deal with. Using neutral creatures like Queensguard or Macemen lets them drop a creature by turn 2 and already start applying that pressure. If you can't deal with these neutral creatures right away, they may end up getting more and more buffs piled on them, and then all of a sudden they're threatening lethal. A big weakness to green, however, is that they have no ways of dealing indirect damage like haste or burn. All their damage is going to come from their creatures, which makes their lethal options a lot more controllable than other archetypes. So using this knowledge, you can afford to take a lot more face hits than you can in other Rush matchups while you collect Faeria and set up your creatures. As long as you stay above 1 life, you're pretty safe. Just be aware of buff thresholds, which usually give 2 attack per buff, and evaluate your risks based on how many cards they have in hand rather than looking at their Faeria count so much. Green Rush will usually have 3 copies of Runin Shrine, which gives them a surprise 2 Faeria, making it a bit more difficult to predict. But what you can predict is their hand size, and how likely it is for them to have certain combinations of cards. Another thing you can predict is where they're able to drop their creatures. Especially watch out for double neutrals, since they do have a few neutral creatures, and Sagami Warrior, which can dash across your lands. If you're sitting on a super low life total, just make sure you have answers to any threats that come down, wherever that may be. Most of the time, you never even need to attack their orb. Since you're not worried about indirect damage, you can sit comfortably at your own orb and focus on well collections instead. This also means that healing cards are less important. If they are overwhelming you though, racing might be your only option. One card that newer players struggle with sometimes is God Hunter, so it is worth mentioning, because this may look great on paper, but in practice is a really easy card to counter. It can't attack your creatures at all, which means you can either slap a taunt down next to it, or simply body block your face. You don't even have to attack it until you've set up a nice favorable value trade, because it can't collect, so it poses no threat to you as long as it doesn't find an opening into your face. When deck building to counter Green Rush, the best cards to use are creatures with high attack stats, such as what you'll find in Yellow Flyers. Cards like Demon Wing are usually quite vulnerable to small removal events like Soul Drain, but green has no such removal, so all of these already pretty efficient flying bodies become even better when you're spending only 3 Faeria to deal 5 damage to a creature. Swarm decks can also do reasonably well against Green Rush if they can swarm early enough to body block. Green usually can't play too many creatures at a time, and suffers from only being able to attack once with each of them, so if you swarm your orb enough, they may never find an opening. Make sure you still have some good high attack cards like Demon Wrangler or Shifting Octopus or something, because you likely can't keep swarming the small things forever. If you're playing Swarm, you also have one unique consideration with the Centerland here. In the last video, I mentioned that you should avoid building this Centerland. However, if you're playing Swarm against Green Rush, you may want to decide otherwise. If they end up building this Centerland, they can drop a massive creature there in the future, and then you won't be able to body block it anymore. The Green Rush player may even decide to race for that center space if they know that you're playing Swarm, because otherwise they may never find an end to your orb. Even if you're not playing Swarm, the Centerland is always a consideration though. Body blocking is one of your main strategies you can use in a pinch. The last archetype I want to talk about is Combo Rush. This isn't a very popular archetype in the meta right now, but it has historically come and gone, and you might face something like it on the ranked ladder here or there, so I thought it was worth mentioning. Usually these decks have a pretty high land count and won't use any double neutrals. That doesn't mean you have the time to sit around though, because once they build their required lands and draw all their combo pieces, they might just one-hit kill you or at least unleash some devastating combo. Obviously, how to counter these combo decks will vary depending on what their combo is, but you can usually categorize their win conditions as either being direct damage or indirect damage, or maybe both. And once you figure out their win conditions, you can counter accordingly. If their win condition is solely direct damage, such as a mega buffed creature to OTK you with, you'll want to body block and land block all 3 spaces adjacent to your orb whenever you can. If they get a foothold next to your orb, you may not be able to manage. And after you've done that, you'll have to push hard towards your opponent's orb because you won't be able to fend off the giant creature forever. Hard removal, though, can often shut these types of decks down, unless they use haste as their OTK creature. So if you run hard removal like Last Nightmare or Frogify, you'll probably be fine. If their deck relies on indirect damage, such as burn things, you'll want to apply pressure fast. Counter-rushing can be a great strategy here since they're so slow with their lands, and their combo won't often come online for quite a while. Some decks, as I mentioned, may have direct and indirect damage, such as the Path to Face deck, which uses many of the yellow haste creatures paired with Path to Paradise and Kobold Barracks as direct damage sources, as well as Barren Sky Vermin paired with these cards, and maybe some other burn cards for indirect damage. To counter a deck like this, you'll have to use a sort of hybrid strategy of body blocking and land blocking, and pushing towards their orb with some urgency at the same time. Especially against Path to Face, land blocking is super important because Path to Paradise requires an open ocean space to drop the land. Stepping on their lands is pretty important too, because the Barren Sky Vermin and Kobold Barracks combo can go on any of their lands that has an open desert space. But that's about all I have for you today. There is one deck that I didn't mention known as Krog Rush. This deck is a little unconventional, but has been keeping Swarm in check lately. So to keep this video short, I'll just briefly say that to fight that deck, you pretty much want to counter rush or go down one side and race them if you're playing a really fast tempo list like Blue Jump or something, and these are pretty much your only options because you'll never be able to outvalue a Krog hitting you in the face unless you top deck a Frogify at the perfect moment. So that's the end of my Countering Rush guide. You can find more guides like this one using the links on screen and in the description. And if you're struggling to face some archetype, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts to give me an idea on what to make next. So thanks for watching everyone, and I hope to see you in the next one.